Part 5, Chapter 5. As soon as we drove into the garage, men rushed to seal the room, and then my dad and Michael jumped out. Michael yelled something to Martin, and I noticed 3 doctors standing ready. I blinked and looked over at Track. He sighed and mumbled something about overprotective fathers, and then he climbed out. I jumped out and stood beside him. The doctors walked over as Michael closed the door to the manor and stood with his back almost against it. 2 other men hurried over, and I inhaled. They were werewolves. One doctor knelt next to me and parted my fur to look at the wounds. I yelped and stepped back. Okay, that hurt. Track looked down at me. You did this, Ray. You will stand still and let them clean you up. His words were harsh, but his voice was not. I lowered my head and stepped back up. The others were kneeling now as well. Shouldn't you take her inside to do this? Track asked, pulling on a shirt that one of the wolves handed to him. The other werewolf looked towards the guarded door. I think we should get her cleaned up out here. One doctor lifted a large jug, and Track put his hand out. Wait, what exactly is that? It's water, to clean any dirt out of the wounds, the man stated, sounding irritated at being questioned. Track nodded, kneeling next to me. The doctor undid the top of the jug and held it over my neck. As the cold water hit, it pushed on the tender wounds. I yelped, backpedaled, and then snorted as the water splashed over my muzzle. Stay still, Track snapped, looking at me with eyes that were not as angry as his words. I nuzzled his cheek with my nose, and he rolled his eyes. Hold still and let them clean it out, or I'll sit on you. You wouldn't, I thought. Wanna bet? I sat still, shivering a bit as several jugs of cold water were used. I did notice one of the 3 doctors slip on a white cloth mask. Seems he may be a tad less civilized than the others, who didn't seem to have any problem with it. Track watched them as they took large wads of gauze and cleaned the fur to better see the damage. He whistled as he bent over my neck. Those are pretty deep. How deep is pretty deep? I asked. Will take several days to heal, no matter what form you're in, he explained, and I huffed. Great. How attractive would this look in my vampire form? I yelped as one doctor scrubbed a tender area, and Track turned on him, growling. The doctor sighed. Mr. Track, there is dirt in here that will fester. We have to get it cleaned out before we can wrap it. The bleeding has already stopped. We have to get the dirt out before it becomes embedded in the healing skin. Vampires didn't get infections, but I wondered if werewolves could. I had never thought to ask. I yelped a few more times during the process. Whatever they were using now stung. My body was shaking, but I stayed as still as I could, and Track stayed close to me, watching the doctors like a hawk. Finally, a doctor took a large spool of thick white gauze and started to wrap it around my neck. Not enough to choke me, but tight enough to stay in place. When they were finally done, Track stood, and he walked towards Michael and my dad, who stood in front of the doors, watching. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye and turned. Some workers were carrying larger jugs towards the pile of rags and gauze where the doctors were putting their things away. One started to dump the liquid. I inhaled and snorted. Bleach, I thought, and Track nodded. Michael pushed some buttons and then opened the door, and we walked inside. Martin was standing on the other side, and the door was quickly closed behind us. Your room or the lab? My dad asked, looking down at me. He still wasn't smiling, but his face had relaxed a bit. My room, I thought, and Track shrugged. I'm sure she'd rather go to her own room. My dad nodded, and we headed down the hallway. It was empty, and there was no Alyssa in sight. Part of me wondered what happened after I left, but that would have to wait. I was surprised she wasn't here to fulfill her wish of seeing me get in some serious trouble. Once inside my room, I trotted over and jumped on my bed. When I turned around, Track shook his head. "Now you got it all wet." I looked down and sighed. They had washed me up, but I was still pretty damp, so was my comforter. Oops, I thought. Then my dad's phone rang. I watched him pull it out as I laid down on the soft bed. "Hey, it was already wet. Why not?" He talked quietly for a few minutes and then hung up. "Jonathan will be here shortly," he stated, giving me a hard look. Ouch. I hated when he looked at me that way. Jonathan, he must have gotten home just about the time I got caught. Who called him? I guess it didn't matter. Just one more person to be ticked at me. I snorted and looked down at my bed. Then my dad walked over and sat next to me. I crawled over to him and laid my head in his lap. I didn't like him being upset with me. He put his hand on top of my head. "Sweetheart, I hope this has shown you what can happen when you try to sneak out." His voice was soft, and so was his touch. I saw Track's brows raise, but I whimpered and nuzzled him. He stroked my head. "You should have come to me, told me what you needed. We would have found a way." I looked up at him, my heart aching for the eyes that stared back at me. I hated seeing that look in his eyes. "This could have ended much worse than it did," he stated. Yeah, I was sure I would hear another entire list of alternative endings before long, even though Ryan and Track had pretty much covered all of them. He shook his head, then did smile a little. "Well, you're home now, cleaned and safe. I want you to promise me you'll never run off like that again." Ugh. There was the P word. I whimpered and gave a little bark, then nudged his other hand. He chuckled. "I'm going to have to make you make that same promise when I can hear your words." Then he looked me over, his eyes moving over my wet bed. "You need to get dried off. You're still wet." That was my dad. He didn't care that I had soaked a very expensive blanket, or that I had now soaked part of his designer slacks or shirt. I loved my dad. I jumped down and shook myself hard. "Ta-da!" I exclaimed with a bark afterwards. I looked up and flinched. Now, the parts of my dad that I had missed a minute ago were covered in water spots. But he only laughed. Well, that's one way to do it, I guess. He looked me over. "Let's get some towels through, though, and dry you off completely while they change that bedding." I looked around him and saw the maid coming in with clean linens. I trotted after him towards the bathroom. Track gave a low growl, and I felt my tail fell quickly. Why did he have to go and spoil this? My dad was not yelling and threatening to lock me in my room for eternity. I was going to get enough yelling from everybody else. Why couldn't he let me have this? When we got into the bathroom, my dad pulled a few large towels from the cupboard and knelt. He rubbed them over me, and I closed my eyes, enjoying the feeling. Then someone started rubbing my legs, and I looked to see Track with another towel. He was not as gentle as my dad, but I didn't complain. Track even got my blow dryer and gave me a few passes with that, although the hard look on his face made sure I didn't enjoy it. When they were finally satisfied, they stood, and we walked back into my room. I looked at the bed, but knowing I was still just a bit damp, I went and lay down on the rug in front of it. My dad's phone rang again. He looked at the screen, then at me. "I'll be back in a little while. You get some rest." I gave a bark, and he winked at me, then walked out of the room, putting the phone to his ear. "Don't even think you're getting off this easy, Track growled as he sat down on the rug with me. He reached over and adjusted part of the bandage that was coming loose. You are in deep, deep, and I mean deep trouble. I get the point, I huffed. I don't think you do, Ray. Ryan is going to have your head, or tail, or maybe both for this. He looked around the room. He isn't too thrilled with your dad right now either, he whispered, even though Michael and Martin were now outside the closed doors. I remembered Ryan and the others standing off against my dad and Michael. That couldn't be good. I had worked hard to make sure both sides of my life got along. That seemed to have taken several steps backwards tonight, all because I was an idiot. I wasn't exactly sure how, but I would find a way to fix all of this. Self-loathing started to sink in, and I laid down, putting my jaw on my foreleg and watching nothing in particular. I sighed now and then, but neither of us said a word. What possessed you to do something so stupid? He finally asked. My ears twitched. I didn't want Phil to hate me. You guys wouldn't let me see him, so I was going to go and make him let me apologize. I sighed. Was that even a real sentence? And did it really sound that dumb? Track drew in a slow breath. And where did you come up with the stupid idea that Phil hates you? Doesn't he? Not even close, he chuckled softly, though his jaw was still tight. I lifted my head, looking at him. Then why doesn't he want to see me? Track turned away from me. Ray, you really need to let things be sometimes. I snorted. See? No one will explain this to me. Phil won't see me, but you say he doesn't hate me. I'm completely confused. My ears twitched in frustration. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I didn't understand. Good, you can stay confused, but your furry butt will also stay put, and, he shook a finger at me, you will never pull another stunt like that again. Ever. I snorted and laid my head back down. I was still as confused as ever, maybe more so now that I knew that Phil didn't hate me. That had seemed the only logical explanation. There was a knock on the door, and we both looked up at it. Track called out, and I sat up as one of the men from the garage walked in. He closed the door behind him and pulled out his phone as he came over. Your alpha would like to talk to you, he said to Track and handed him the phone. Track stood up, thanked the man, and took the cell phone. This is Track, he stated. The older man looked down at me, a mixture of pity and worry on his face. I lowered my head. Yeah, this was all my fault. Dumb, spoiled vampire girl just had to sneak out and cause all this trouble. Track walked back over and handed the man the phone, thanking him. The werewolf nodded, then left. I watched Track pace. What is it? I finally asked. It's worse than I thought, he stated, and I walked over to him. He looked down at me. Ryan called to talk to your dad, and your dad refused to talk to him. What? I exclaimed, giving a shocked bark. Yeah, and your dad sent a message to Ryan. What was the message? He glanced at the door, then looked back at me, his eyes tight. Not to come anywhere on manor grounds. None of the pack is allowed here right now. Except you? I asked, the panic mixing with guilt now. He shrugged. For now. I lowered my head until my nose almost touched the ground. What had I done? The door opened then, this time without a knock, and Jonathan walked in. He gave Track a quick glance and then headed straight towards me. When he knelt, I lowered my head even more, the guilt squeezing my stomach. What had seemed an innocent and nearly honorable mission had blown up, badly. He put his hand on my neck and lifted part of the bandage to inspect my wounds, then carefully tucked the gauze back in place. "She'll be fine in a few days," Track growled. "What happened to her?" Jonathan nearly hissed, keeping his eyes on my bandages. "I snuck out to go to Polson," I thought, wondering why I ever thought it was a good idea. "You planned to do this?" he stated, the hurt heavy in his voice. "Yes," was all I could manage to say, my head still lowered. He was silent for a long moment. "What happened to your neck?" he finally asked in a soft voice. "Those are self-inflicted," Track snapped. "Those were made by wolves' teeth," Jonathan shot back, his voice picking up volume and anger, though his gaze stayed down on me. "Tell me how she managed to do that by herself." Track stepped up next to us. "She obviously didn't do it to herself. We caught her in Polson. Ryan was mouthing her and she turned too fast." "Mouthing her?" Jonathan nearly growled, looking up. I watched his face tighten, and then he stood up slowly, turning to face Track. "It's a wolf thing. You wouldn't understand," came the sharp reply from my best friend. I saw Jonathan's hand clench into a fist, and I stepped up between them. "This is all my fault," I thought. "Please. My dad and Ryan already had it out. I don't need you two squaring off because of my stupidity." Neither one moved. They both stood staring hard at each other. I finally nudged Jonathan's leg with my nose. "Please, you guys, stop. Please." Jonathan looked down at me and Track stormed off, stopping a few paces away. "Reina, why didn't you talk to me?" he said, again kneeling. The anger on his face was replaced with hurt. I don't know. I know no one would just let me go." "And don't you think there was a very good reason for that?" I lowered my head again, and he put his hand on my back. Track threw his hands up. "Great! You're going to baby her too," he barked, and I looked up. Track pointed at me, shaking his head. "You need a good old-fashioned wolf butt kicking, Ray, and you know it. Maybe then you'd understand that you have an alpha for a reason." His body was so tight I thought he would snap in front of me. I shivered and lowered my eyes. I never thought I would see him look at me that way. My insides were clenched so tight and my stomach felt sick. I had seen Track mad before, but I was never on the receiving end of it, and I hated it. "No one is going to harm any part of her," Jonathan growled, standing up slowly. "Oh crap, here we go again. Guys, listen, please." "Who said harm?" Track shot out, taking a step closer. "I said kick her butt. Teach her a lesson so she doesn't pull something like this again. You guys baby her too much. She needs someone willing to make her understand just how serious this was." "And just who would that be?" Now Jonathan's voice was starting to scare me. It was low, deep, and full of silent warnings. I barked loudly, but neither turned. "I would love to be the one," Track chuckled, although there was no humor in it. "But it's Ryan's place to put her in hers." "Put her in her place?" Jonathan's brows rose, and his chin lowered a bit. "Yeah, again. A wolf thing," Track spat. "I know you try to pretend to understand, but you don't." Track took another step forward, and I made sure I was physically between the two of them now. You know nothing about werewolves or pack life. Reina is part of our pack and its rules. She broke those rules and she needs to take her punishment. No one will punish my daughter but me, came a booming voice, and we all turned. My dad walked over, two of his own bodyguards behind him, Michael and Martin right behind them. Track shook his head. You keep babying her like this and she's gonna end up in a situation that some bandages won't be able to fix. He was bent forward a bit now and his eyes were tight. He felt cornered, and I could smell the anger swimming through the room. I barked loudly again, and my dad looked down at me. Like I said, no one will punish her unless it's me. His eyes softened as he looked at me, and I took a step closer to him, my tail between my legs. Then he turned towards the doctors and nodded. Two maids scurried in and headed towards my closet. What's going on? I thought, panic rushing through me. Track laughed a mad laugh, throwing his arms up. Oh, that's just great. Take her away from here. Take me away, I barked, looking at my dad. But I'm sorry, I won't do it again. I hurried to my dad, leaving Track and Jonathan to stare each other down. They wouldn't do anything too stupid with him here, and I had other things to worry about right now. It's just for a few days, sweetheart, he said as he knelt, his voice sad, while I sort the situation out. I don't understand, Dad, I barked, and then whimpered. I just snuck out. They caught me. I'm back home. I swear I will never do something so stupid again. Don't you get it, Ray? Track yelled, and I turned to him. You didn't just sneak out. You pitted your pack against your family. He glared at Jonathan. What? No, I yelped and started to bark at my dad. Please, Dad, no. I closed my eyes and started my mantra. I had to shift back so I could talk to them. I heard them arguing around me, but I pushed their voices out. Then something slammed into my side, and I landed with a thud. Jonathan was there, his hands on my side and his eyes wide. Do not shift, he yelled. When he realized I was listening, he shook his head, moving his hands. Those wounds are deep. If you shift and still have blood in your veins, I could bleed out, I thought, and he nodded. Great. I was stuck on 4 legs with no way to talk to my dad. Your wolf skin is thicker and there's more tissue, he explained, moving off of me and sitting up. I get it, I thought, growling in frustration. I saw the woman move to my dresser with a suitcase. I noticed her hands were shaking a bit, but they didn't look up as they worked quickly and quietly. Where am I going? I growled again, shaking a bit myself. Somewhere safe, Jonathan said softly, looking at me. Meaning, they don't want to stay with me here because I'll tell the pack and we may try to come for you, Track laughed, again, without humor. He heard a string of howls then and turned towards the window. Michael pulled his phone out and Track shook his head. He walked towards the door. Don't bother. That's for me, he stated in a sour voice. Then he looked down at me, his eyes locking onto mine. They were right not to let me know where they're taking you. I trotted up to him, but Michael stepped in front of me. Track knelt a little and looked around the massive legs, resting his forearms on his knees. Don't worry, Ray, you're still pack, and pack takes care of each other. He winked, flashed me a hard smile, then turned and jogged out of the room. Michael went to turn, but my dad stopped him with a word. I barked for him to come back, then barked again when he didn't. This couldn't be happening. I knew what I did was wrong, very wrong, but really, all I did was sneak out. I got caught and was back home. Nothing really bad happened. Like Track said, the wounds on my neck were my own fault. I shook my head, unable to fathom what was happening. My dad knelt down in front of me. Jonathan stood and went to the women who were packing my things. I watched him look through the suitcase. Great. Now he would see my underwear. That may seem a bit minor with all that was going on, but really, it was a bit awkward. When my dad said my name, I turned back to him. He reached out and put his hand on my jaw. I know you don't understand why we're doing all of this. I know that it seems what you did shouldn't create so much chaos. And, well, normally that may be true. I tilted my head and he continued, I need to find out just why they have been going to such lengths to keep you out of Polson, he stated. I thought Phil was mad at me, I barked. Jonathan turned and translated, and I stiffened. My dad knew? I snorted, and Jonathan gave me an apologetic shrug. He only told me this after this happened, my dad explained. I'm not happy that you kept that from me. He looked at me for a long moment, then he shook his head. I don't know exactly what they are hiding over there or why, but you're alpha or not, he had no right. I heard him in the house, I barked. I had forgotten that part. Jonathan took something out of one of the female's hands, put it back in the dresser, and picked up something else, putting it in the suitcase. I tried to take a mental inventory of what he could possibly be seeing, and moaned. Who heard you? Jonathan asked, turning to look at me. I heard Phil. I explained the best I could, and he told my dad, who frowned and nodded. I will get to the bottom of this, and then I will fix it. He gave me a dad look. You, however, will stay where I send you, without any trouble, until I do. I sighed and sat down hard. Where am I going? When Jonathan relayed my question to my dad, he shook his head. I don't know everything about wolves, that's true, but I do know that packs can communicate mentally. I'm not sure what the distance is, but if they're still right outside, I'm not going to chance it. I don't want you and my pack hating each other, I said with a whimper, and then looked at Jonathan. He frowned, but translated. I don't want that either, my dad replied softly. We all love you, Reina, differently, but we do. I wasn't sure what he meant by the differently part, but at least he seemed sincere about the rest. I will get this straightened out, sweetheart. I moved closer to him and rubbed against his chest. I needed to cry. My own chest was so tight and my heart ached to the point it was hard to breathe. Just hours ago, my two worlds existed peacefully together. Now, I had somehow ruined that. My dad said he would fix this. I had to trust him. He was my dad. Plus, I also wanted to know why they were keeping things from me. Pack wasn't supposed to do that. Another maid walked out of my closet with a larger suitcase, and Jonathan walked over, unzipped it, and started to go through it. Really? Was nothing sacred? How much stuff do I need for a few days? I asked. He didn't reply. My dad stood and turned to Michaud. Are the cars ready? When my bodyguard nodded, my dad turned to Jonathan, who was pulling a shirt off a hanger and handing it to the maid. He stepped out and nodded. Let's go then, my dad said, and turned to walk out of the room. Jonathan quickly pulled several other things off hangers, handed them to her, and followed us out. When we neared the garage, a doctor stepped up and handed my dad a large duffel bag and something too small for me to see. Once inside, Michael opened the car door and I jumped up, resolved and overwhelmed by all that was happening. There was a thick blanket on the floor between the seats. I sat on it and then laid down as I watched them huddle together and talk. I had caused all this. If my dad could fix it, I would go where he told me to go. I sighed, and after a few minutes, Jonathan walked up. "Can you step out for a minute?" he asked. I stood and jumped out. I shook myself hard and then looked around. Jonathan walked back into the manor and then motioned me to follow. I tilted my head, but followed. Did my dad change his mind? Hope crept in and I trotted over quickly. He shut the door to the garage a bit and then knelt, slipping a chain over my neck. He was careful as he laid it over my bandage. "It's a new tracking device," he stated. "This one should withstand almost anything, even for you," he winked. Okay, I thought, and he smiled and stood back up. Well, so much for the hope. We walked back into the garage. I jumped into the car and he climbed in after me. My dad leaned in the door. "I'll call you in just a little while." He smiled, reaching over and stroking my cheek. "I don't want to leave, Dad," I whimpered, standing at the door. "I swear I'll stay here. I'll do whatever you want. Please, Daddy." My heart ached. This wasn't like when he had to leave for work. I didn't like saying goodbye to my dad. I whimpered and stretched my neck out towards him. He smiled, but his eyes were sad. "I love you, sweetheart. Don't worry. I will fix this and you'll be home before you know it." Then he slowly closed the door. My throat tightened and I gave a sad bark, whimpering loudly as I watched him step away. I heard other doors close and then the engine start. Put my paws on the side of the window. It was hard, but not impossible to see through the glass. The colored button on the handle was blinking red. It was daylight out there. A wave of panic rushed through me. I hated to drive in open sunlight. Dusk or dawn was one thing, but out in the full daylight, I shivered. I knew the cars were made for this, but what if there was a crack, some small flaw where light could get in? I looked over at Jonathan, and he gave me an encouraging smile. "Wolfie!" I yelped and gave a hard bark. Jonathan said something and the car stopped. It had only moved a few feet. I barked again and he put his hand out. "I'll have someone bring it," he tried quietly. I barked again. If I had to sleep somewhere else, I wanted something to comfort me. My best friend, my pack, and my family were about to square off, and I didn't understand why. I needed this. I barked again, then looked at Jonathan, the plea in my eyes. He nodded and pulled out his phone. I turned back and watched out the darkened window. "Someone's bringing it down," he stated, putting his phone on the seat. I didn't care that now someone would know my little secret. It was obvious most of the house staff knew already. When my bedding was changed, Wolfie was always still under my pillow waiting. A few minutes later I saw a door open to the main house, and then Jonathan reached around me and put his hand on the handle. I jumped down and backed up, watching the door. A woman held out my stuffed wolf, and I took it gently in my teeth. The door was closed, and the car headed out. Okay, so maybe that was a little spoiled on my part, but I didn't care. I hated what was happening. I couldn't stand the thought of sleeping away from the manor. At least this way, I would have Wolfie with me. I laid the ragged stuffed animal gently on the seat opposite from Jonathan. Then I hopped up and laid down, pulling it under my chin. I didn't look at him as the car left the manor. I did flinch as the sunlight tried to get through the thick tinting. The shields had slid up over the windows, but I knew that the other windows were made of a special glass that still allowed the drivers to see out. I didn't move to get closer, but I did watch the world that I rarely ever got to see. It was so bright, the colors so different, even through the thick tint. Finally, I turned away from the odd scene and laid my head on the seat. Jonathan's phone rang, and I only turned my eyes as he lifted it and looked at the screen. He didn't answer it, though. Instead, he started pushing buttons, his jaw tight. I sighed and closed my eyes. And that's where I'm going to stop.